Welcome, everyone. I'm Dan Palazzolo. I'm co-director of the Marshall Center, along with Gary McDowell, who's seated here to my right, as he normally is to my right. I want to welcome you. I want to welcome you to the third lecture of our Marshall Center series today. And as you know, our lecture, some of you probably know this, but our lecture series and our other programs are made possible through a really generous grant from the Thomas W. Smith Foundation. We're very grateful to the foundation for carrying on this, this grant again for another 3 years. And as you also might know, the Marshall Center is devoted to a great books approach to understanding and practicing responsible leadership. And our speaker today fits within that mission perfectly. Dr. Thomas Merrill is an associate professor of government and the Associate Director of the Political Theory Institute at American University. He is currently a visiting fellow at the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He also had a faculty appointment at St. John's in Annapolis, Maryland, and was a staffer for the President's Council on Bioethics from 2006 to 2008. Dr. Merrill has published articles and reviews on early modern political theory, American political thought, and bioethics. Among his publications is a book entitled Hume and the Politics of Enlightenment, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015 and won the Delbert Winthrop Prize for Best Recent Work in Political Philosophy. I have a copy of the book right here. Unfortunately, we do not have copies for signing because this is a very valuable book, and turns out in hardcover it's a very expensive book. But it is available on Kindle and will soon be coming out on paperback, and you'll want to look out for that. Dr. Merrill is also co-editor of a volume entitled Political Theory of the Civil War. It's forthcoming with University Press of Kansas in the summer of 2018. Dr. Merrill's talk today is entitled Hume's Machiavellian Case for Commerce. Please welcome welcome Dr. Merrill. All right, we're going to pull this. When you're hip like the Marshall Center, everything has to be done on YouTube and social media, and so that's why we need to transfer the mic over.
Is this working? Can you guys hear me? Okay, all right, great. I should start by thanking Dan and Gary and the Marshall Center for having me here and the Jepson School. It's a big honor for me to be here. I was looking at all of the other speakers who are here this term, and I'm glad to say that I'm bringing the average down. So I hope you're enjoying all the other speakers as well. It's also a really big honor for me in particular to speak in this series because I grew up and spent the majority of my childhood within a 3-mile radius of where we are at this moment. So as a graduate of Douglas Southall Freeman, yay, I just really am honored to be here. I want to say a special thank you. Members of my family are here. They've put up with me for many years, and finally they're going to listen to a lecture. And also many of my friends of my family and from overall my entire life are here. So I want to say a special thank you and welcome to them. So. Thank you very much. The title of my lecture is Hume's Machiavellian Case for Commerce. My topic today is David Hume's views on commerce. Before beginning, however, I should say something about why we might care about this topic today. I don't think I will surprise any of you if I note that our world seems to be in kind of a bad place at the moment. Since the election of President Trump a year ago, there's been a widespread sense of crisis. A crisis not just about this or that policy, but about the viability of our entire regime. A consequence of feeling that we are in a crisis is that we become excessively fixated on the events of the day. Which of us hasn't felt compelled to be continually checking the headlines, anxiously awaiting some new development? Yet, however tempting, this orientation by the felt urgency of the moment may be an obstacle to our ability to step back and reflect on our overall situation. From a broader perspective, our moment is one of populist rage against elites and against institutions. President Trump won the Republican primary largely by appealing to people who felt left behind by the globalizing, highly technological economy we live in. And although he didn't win, Bernie Sanders did surprisingly well in the Democratic primary by speaking to many of the same economic themes that Trump did. I remember that I have an uncle who told me he was either going to vote for Trump or for Sanders. He wasn't sure which one. So this lecture is for him. There is a general feeling afoot in the country, on right and left alike, that elites are manipulating the system for their own benefit. Think of the familiar worries about growing inequality in America, the fact, as we're told, that the top 1% is accumulating the much greater part of the growth in income, as Thomas Piketty has argued, or the fact that the income of the median person in the United States has, we're also told, not grown appreciably since 1980. Whatever one might ultimately have to say about these facts, no serious observer of the political scene can avoid having an opinion about them. Now, I spend my professional time reading the thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith, who made the original case for what we've come to call classical liberalism or commercial republicanism, the ancestor, not the same thing, but the ancestor of what we today call free market capitalism. And the striking and somewhat surprising thing about our current debates from this point of view is the extent to which our idea today of free markets has gotten entangled with our anger against elites. Since Adam Smith, Hume, and Montesquieu understood themselves to be opponents of unearned privilege, feudalism was, after all, what they were trying to destroy. So the most obvious question for anyone thinking about a topic like Hume on commerce is something like this. In this moment when the general public seems to have serious doubts about free markets, is there anything we can learn from the original proponents of classical liberalism? I don't expect that we're going to find policy prescriptions. In fact, I try to avoid finding policy prescriptions. But we might ask, is there anything that we've forgotten that those proponents know that might deepen our understanding of our own time? Is there anything in their approach that might help us think through our own situation? I believe that the original proponents of commercial republicanism do offer an approach to these questions rather different from the ones that we're most familiar with, ones that we might learn from. And for those of you who've forgotten your history about Hume and Smith, or perhaps never knew, which is completely understandable, a bit of context is in order. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher, essayist and historian who lived from 1711 to 1776. He was Adam Smith's best friend, but maybe more important for us, he was a significant influence on the American founders, especially James Madison, notably in the famous Federalist 10, but also Alexander Hamilton. Thomas Jefferson, not so much. That might be a question for a different lecture. Today, I'm going to talk about Hume's writings on commerce, in particular, a series of essays on political economy that we find at the beginning of part 2 of his essays, which is one of his major works. As will become apparent, I think that Hume's defense of commerce is much more populist or democratic in spirit than you might expect. More importantly, I want to suggest to you that Hume's defense of commerce is intimately related to, and not really intelligible without, his thoughts on what might be called the problem of enlightenment, the question of how philosophy should speak to or present itself to ordinary life and ordinary people. In order to make this case, I'm going to tell you a story about how Hume's case for commerce develops. And I'm going to start with an episode of Hume's argument that seems at first glance directly contrary to what I just said about the populist spirit of Hume's defense of commerce. Hume's apparently amoral willingness to give advice to a self-aggrandizing sovereign about how to increase his power. So that's the plan. And before I get into the meat of the talk, I should say when I was giving Dan the title for this lecture, I'd written this lecture and I was trying to think of something that would make the title seem more exciting, and so I put the word Machiavellian in there. Machiavelli is, in some sense, present throughout all of this lecture, but the name will only appear once. So in the interest of not having false advertising, if you are interested in that, you'd like to ask, that would be something we can talk about in the question period. Okay? There are going to be 3 sections to this paper, which I will tell you as we go so that you know how far we are into this whole thing. So this is part 1. Strangely enough, Hume begins his discussion of commerce with an apparently unrelated remark. The greater part of mankind, he says, may be divided into 2 groups: shallow thinkers who fall short of the truth and abstruse thinkers who go beyond it. Most of us are, of course, the first. But there are some persons of, quote, solid understanding who somehow discover genuine general truths about the world. The problem is that most of us can't distinguish between the abstruse thinkers and the solid thinkers. We tend to see things only through the lens of our particular interest and distrust anything that smacks of sophistication. It's really a lesson for us academics. But there are general principles that, quote, prevail in the general course of things, Hume tells us, and that are worth our knowing and trying to understand. But then we're compelled to wonder from this presentation of our situation, how is enlightenment possible? If most or all of us tend to interpret things only through the lens of our particular perspective, how could we ever ascend to some larger view of things? I think that's crudely stated, that's the problem that he starts with. Hume begins his actual defense of commerce by remarking that in every developed society, a third class of persons comes into existence after the essential classes of farmers on the one hand and manufacturers on the other. At some point in human history, agriculture became so productive that far fewer hands are needed to produce enough food for the whole society than were required at earlier stages. Obviously, when societies begin to get wealthy. Hume asks a simple question: what should be done with the superfluous workers, the workers because you now can produce more with fewer workers? Should they apply themselves to the finer arts, that is, to luxuries or refinements, or should they be claimed by the sovereign and made to serve his armies for the sake of expanding, quote, the dominions of the state abroad and spreading its fame? Not to put too fine a point on it, the question that he begins the commerce part with, which course of action will most strengthen the sovereign's military power? The essay of Commerce is an extended deliberation on just this question. As Hume presents it, it is, in the first instance, a question for the sovereign, not a question for the rest of us. A question to be decided in the light of the sovereign's interests and the sovereign's necessities. It's necessary to underline the apparent amorality of Hume's treatment of this question. The essay assumes that the sovereign is motivated solely by a desire to increase his military power, or in the case of Queen Elizabeth, perhaps her military power. And it never stops to ask whether it might be morally problematic to increase the power of a sovereign, regardless of whether that sovereign will use that power wisely or not. Hume thus poses this question: why should a sovereign concerned solely with his power not simply draft all of the, quote, superfluous workers into his army? He asks, is it not the case that Sparta, one of the greatest of the ancient republics, which banished commerce and luxury and dedicated its citizens to its army, was able to raise and support armies that were greater by far on a per capita basis than the armies of modern nations? Why should not sovereigns, quote, consult their own interests more than the happiness of their subjects and, quote, return to the maxims of ancient policy by banishing commerce and luxury? That's Hume's opening question. Hume offers not a hint of moral critique of the sovereign's desire to acquire. Instead, he teaches the sovereign a lesson in realpolitik. Sparta, he says, was able to inspire such extreme public spiritedness in its citizens only through a, quote, extraordinary concurrence of circumstances. Being free states, the citizens believed that they were fighting for themselves. Being small states, the ancient republics were continually endangered by external threats. Those two causes together kept the Spartans in a continual state of high tension. But neither of these causes is easy for a monarch in modern times, i.e. Hume's times, to reproduce. The first, since it would require a different form of government, right? Those were republics. We're talking about a monarchy. The second, because the sovereign wants to dominate his neighbors, not live in fear of them. The self-aggrandizing sovereign must then seek some other way to motivate his citizens to fight on his behalf. Quote, sovereigns must take mankind as they find them and cannot produce to introduce any violent change in their principles or ways of thinking. That's Hume's advice to the sovereign. The sovereign's problem echoes Hume's own problem of enlightenment, how to get human beings to serve a goal that they do not recognize as their own. In the essays, commerce first comes to view as an answer to this question. Hume makes the following argument to the sovereign. In a society without, quote, manufactures and mechanic arts, most of the people must be farmers. But without manufacturers and without luxuries, those farmers, even though they're able to produce more goods through their skill in industry, can acquire nothing beyond what they can make for themselves. They have, therefore, no reason to increase their skill in industry. They have no incentive to do anything more than what they're already doing. But when there are manufacturers to acquire, the workers have a reason to work harder. Quote, "The superfluity is not lost, but is exchanged with manufacturers for those commodities, which men's luxury makes them covet." Hume assures the sovereign that the labor is not lost to the public use. That is, not lost to the sovereign's desire for self-aggrandizement. For the manufacturers can always be converted when the need arises into military power, through a tax or through a draft. Hume encourages the sovereign to see the manufacturers of commercial society, though ostensibly private property, as a storehouse of labor, that's his phrase, that can at any time be taken by the sovereign for his own purposes. The difference between the Spartan strategy and the commercial strategy then has nothing to do with morality. They're merely different ways of motivating human beings to act for the sake of the sovereign's self-interest. Quote, "It's a violent method, and in most cases impracticable, to oblige the worker to toil in order to raise from the land more than what subsists himself and his family. Furnish him with manufactures and commodities, and he'll do it himself. Afterwards, you'll find it easy to seize some part of his superfluous labor and employ it in the public service without giving him his wanted return." Hume thus offers the sovereign a hard-headed lesson in human motivation. Allow the workers to think that they're working for themselves, and they'll work much harder for you than if you told them that truth at the start. The key to this advice is that the sovereign's interest and the worker's interest, or at least what they think is in their interest, coincide, at least in this case. In light of the geopolitical competition of Europe in the 18th century, sovereigns of Hume's time would no doubt be well advised to take Hume's advice. But Hume has not put all of his cards on the table, for there are unintended, or at least unarticulated, consequences of his advice, consequences that only become clear as his argument proceeds. First, he points out that commerce will increase the number of persons in the state who are relatively well off, and that this is good for the state. Quote, "It will not, I hope, be considered as a superfluous digression if I here observe that as the multitude of mechanical arts is advantageous, so is the great number of persons to whose share the production of those arts fall." Right? If you want to be a powerful sovereign, it's better to have a lot of people, because then you can have a bigger army. Superfluidity in the economy leads Hume to make an observation that might well seem, from the point of view of the sovereign's naked self-interest, superfluous. But the betterment of the economic condition of the great mass of citizens is one that Hume, somewhat unexpectedly, endorses on normative grounds. Quote, "Every person, if possible, ought to enjoy the fruits of his labor, in as full possession of all the necessaries and as many of the conveniences of life. The state is stronger when the people at large are well off, not to mention that when a few have most of the riches, they will use their power to oppress the poor. It's in this regard," Hume says, "that England has, quote, a great advantage over any nation at present in the world," i.e. around 1750, in that in England, the common people are richer than the people in any other nation. But it's not until the following essay of refinement in the arts that Hume indicates the full consequences of liberating commerce for political life. There we learn that commerce brings with it a sociological or a cultural revolution that cannot help but prepare for a political one. In societies without commerce and luxuries, Hume says, there tend to be two classes of persons: the owners of land on the one hand and their vassals or tenants on the other. Pre-commercial society had at its core masters and slaves, in large part simply because of the economic realities of that kind of society. The vassals are, quote, necessarily dependent and fitted for slavery and subjection, especially where they possess no riches and are not valued for their knowledge in agriculture, as must always be the case where the arts are neglected. The owners of the land, on the other hand, naturally erect themselves into petty tyrants and must either submit to an absolute master, for the sake of peace and order, or if they will preserve their independency, like the ancient barons, you think of the feudal lords, they must fall into feuds and contests among themselves and throw the whole society into such confusion as is perhaps worse than the most despotic government. That, in a nutshell, is Hume's analysis of feudal pre-Tudor English society. But where the pursuit of luxury increases commerce, quote, the peasants, by a proper cultivation of the land, become rich and independent. No longer are there only masters and slaves. A new type of human being comes to the fore. Quote, the tradesmen and merchants acquire a share of the property and draw authority and consideration to the middling rank of men, who are the best and firmest basis of public liberty. These submit not to slavery like the peasants, from poverty and meanness of spirit, and having no hopes of tyrannizing over others like the barons, they are not tempted for the sake of that gratification to submit to the tyranny of their sovereign. They covet equal laws which may secure their property and preserve them from monarchical as well as aristocratical tyranny. The middling rank of men, then, denotes both an economic condition and a psychic disposition. These human beings have enough economic wherewithal not to be directly dependent on another human being. That economic independence, in turn, is the indispensable condition for seeing themselves as self-ruling property owners. Hume sketches in these few lines the basic thrust of his interpretation of English history, from the beginning of the Tudor reigns up through the achievement of parliamentary supremacy in the 17th century. Commerce was, he says, an essential cause of the political revolutions of that century. Right? Remember, in the 1600s, when Parliament finally takes power. Quote, the lower house is the support of our popular government, and all the world acknowledges that it owes its chief influence and consideration to the increase of commerce, which threw such a balance of power into the hands of the commons. Hume neglects, at least in this context, to mention the fact, of which his contemporaries would have been all too aware, and which he himself would make a major theme of his masterwork, The History of England, that the commercial revolution that produced the middling rank of men culminated, not entirely accidentally, in the execution of one king and the forcible replacement of another. But if we keep these facts in mind, his advice to the sovereign begins to take on a different cast. For if the English experience is any guide, the sovereign can liberate commerce and increase his military power only at the price of unleashing a far-reaching social transformation. That transformation predictably leads to the gradual development of a class of human beings that will sooner or later want to have some say in ruling themselves. Put differently, Hume's advice to the sovereign has a nasty surprise hidden within it. The sovereign who liberates commerce in order to bolster his military power sets in motion a series of changes that will undermine his power or that of his successors, and may even get them killed. Hume's amorality, it seems, runs deeper or is of a different character than we first thought. Of course, if any sovereign who happened to read Hume's essays, probably there were no such people, but if they had happened to read Hume's essays, if any sovereign reading Hume's essays is deceived, that does not necessarily mean that Hume lied. It may simply have been true that early modern European monarchs faced a choice between not liberating commerce and losing out to stronger neighbors on the one hand, and liberating commerce and fatally weakening their monarchies in the long run on the other. The fact remains that Hume is perfectly willing to offer European sovereigns the attractive fruit of military power without making its predictable consequences too clear. We need to rethink the character of that original advice to the sovereign. As we saw, Hume's apparently amoral advice was that in order to get someone to work for you, you should not exhort them or appeal to their public spiritedness. That's not going to work just by telling people to do the right thing. Instead, you should make them think they're working in their own self-interest, even when they're benefiting you. But we can now see that Hume's advice to the sovereign was in fact an example of the very point that he's making. Hume starts his essays on commerce by appealing to the interests of the sovereign as the sovereign's likely to understand them. Most sovereigns only care about their own power. Hume is speaking to them in the language they understand. He goes on to tell the sovereign how to pursue those interests most effectively. That is, without any constraint for morality or the common good. And yet, at the same time, he only alludes to the predictable consequences of that advice, which could easily be the destruction of both monarch and monarchy. Hume puts into practice the very advice that he gives to the sovereign. Yet we might wonder, in the service of what? Right? I think it's pretty clear that Hume actually does this. It's not so clear why he does this. So if you're reading the book, you might be confused. The surface amorality of Hume's advice to the sovereign, while not false, is not the deepest element of what Hume is up to in the essays on commerce. The meaning of Hume's enlightenment remains to be ascertained. Okay, that was part one. Part two. One could summarize the argument to this point by saying that the rise of the middle class is the submerged theme that shapes the surface, without entirely rising to the surface, of Hume's advice to sovereigns. If we're to understand the full meaning of Hume's enlightenment, or the education that he's offering us in this book, it's to this social group that we must turn our attention. The essays on commerce are not, however, the first time in Hume's work that the question of what he calls the middling rank of men has come up. In an early essay on essay writing, Hume has described his task in the essays as being a kind of ambassador, quote, from the dominions of learning to those of conversation, meaning a kind of intermediary between the Enlightenment or philosophers and the world of polite, i.e. non-philosophic society. Earlier than that, in the Treatise of Human Nature, which is his first great book, he described his political project as forging a kind of alliance or coalition between skeptical philosophers and people he calls honest gentlemen, meaning something roughly like what we today would call the bourgeoisie. The essays, one might say, have all along been a kind of dialogue between Hume and his readers. The essays by its nature is a kind of democratic genre, right? It's something that's available to many people, right, in a way that plays are not, because to see a play you have to go see it in person. Only now in the essays, however, does Hume's audience become something more than a passive auditor of Hume's discourses. Only now does it, as it were, come to the fore and become an explicit theme of the book. Only now does Hume explicitly begin to describe his audience to itself. In order to understand the full meaning of Hume's enlightenment, then, we'll need to understand the middling rank of men, not in the light of some abstract moral code, but as a specific human type with a distinctive psychic and moral outlook. Who then are Hume's interlocutors, and what is their world like? Let's begin with a crucial but easily overlooked fact about Hume's view of the middling rank of men. They are, I quoted this before, what he says, the best and firmest basis of public liberty. He means that they are the sociological basis for the liberal political institutions that he's described in part one of the essays. Part one of the essays has a lot of things about political institutions. It's really very close to the Federalist Papers, if you know that. You might see this as a supplement to that kind of institutional analysis. This is the cultural or sociological dimension of the project. The separation of powers, the rule of law, and so on are critical to preserving political and personal freedom, but they can't exist in a vacuum. Liberal political institutions need a liberal political culture. Above all, they need the members of that society to be passionately attached to those institutions and willing, if need be, to fight for them. Institutions cannot possibly sustain themselves with mere parchment barriers or moralistic claims. They need constituencies that resist the inevitable pressure to change and that are willing to allow rulers to do what they're supposed to do, to rule. Hume argued in part one that individual liberty under law is the political good. That's what we should care about when we think about government. And that the rule of law requires the separation of powers. We can now see that the discussion of the middling rank of men, and hence of commerce, provides another crucial element to that argument. Even if the purpose of government is only to enforce the rules of property, and so to protect individuals from arbitrary power, intelligent individuals, even sensible knaves, will recognize a powerful individual interest in preserving and bolstering the middling rank of men as the ultimate support for political freedom. In Montesquieu's terms, the middling rank of men form the spirit of the liberal regime in England. Their habits, opinion, mores, and psychic dispositions form its center of gravity. Hume describes their basic outlook first as it appears in private or non-political life, and then as it shows itself in public life. I'm going to talk briefly about each one of those. The commercial way of life, seen now in its social character, Hume argues, includes three aspects that contribute to human happiness or enlightenment. First, a key element of happiness is work, which brings challenge and engagement. We don't want to just sit around and get a check from someone. Challenge and engagement, Hume thinks, is good both in itself and for its fruits. Second, ages of commerce also tend to produce refinements and even revolutions in intellectual matters. Quote, "The spirit of the age affects all the arts, and the minds of men, being once roused from their lethargy," that's what it's like being in a commercial society, you're roused from your lethargy, "put into a fermentation, turn themselves on all sides, and carry improvements into every art and science. Profound ignorance is totally banished, and men enjoy the privilege of rational creatures to think as well as to act, to cultivate the pleasures of the mind as well as those of the body." Perhaps the most important benefit of commerce is enlightenment itself. Hume does not mean that most human beings in the commercial age will dedicate their lives to reasoning above all else, as does Hume's skeptic, one of his characters, and perhaps Hume himself, or that it would be good if they did dedicate their lives to reasoning in that sense. They see reasoning not as good in itself, but good as a means of ruling oneself and the condition for possessing dignity. Hume thinks they're better off for doing so. It's better, even for those who have no attraction to philosophy or to radical questioning or things like that, to think for themselves to the extent possible, because it's better for them to rule themselves to the extent possible. Finally, commercial society compels men to be more sociable. It leads them into cities, makes them pay attention to fashion and social opinion, and practice politeness and the virtues of civility. Commercial society is life with other people, both physically and psychically. Thus, Hume concludes, industry, knowledge, and humanity are bound together by an indissoluble chain and are found, from experience as well as reason, to be peculiar to the more polished and what are commonly denominated the more luxurious ages. Politically speaking, the spirit of the middling rank of men is attachment to the rule of law. Here, the rejection of feudalism, the regime defined by masters and slaves, is essential. Psychically, the middling rank of men are defined by the refusal to be either master or slave. That's really the key. Like the honest gentleman in the treatise, they mainly want to be left alone to lead their lives as they see fit. They also recognize, however, that no one can avoid being a master or a slave without some political authority to establish law. Without authority, one cannot avoid being a baron, lording it over the serfs, or just another one of the serfs. Without law, authority cannot avoid being just another master. In their own eyes, then, the self-interest of the middling rank of men in material terms, but also, more importantly, in terms of their own sense of their own dignity, is inseparable from the rule of law. The connection between the perceived self-interest and dignity of the middling rank of men and the rule of law, and indeed only that connection, is the reason why they're passionately attached to law. Indeed, they, quote, covet equal laws which may secure their property and preserve them from monarchical as well as aristocratical tyranny. That connection is the psychic spring of the regime, the passionate attachment, which binds the loves and hatreds of citizens together with the institutions of the polity. Okay, part 3. There's no doubt something dressed up or prettified in the portrait of the spirit of liberal regimes that I just sketched. I think Hume knows this. In part 1 of the essays, he remarks that even or especially free governments, republics, like the ones that we have, habitually act with a certain injustice towards the territories which they conquer. Right? Their morality is not absolute. Free governments are, he says, silently quoting Machiavelli, the happiest for those who live in them, but also the most ruinous and oppressive to their provinces. I think he's thinking of England's relationship with Ireland. Monarchs are, paradoxically, more humane. Yet whatever warts Hume may have discerned in commercial republics, he nevertheless took seriously the task of educating and elevating the culture of commercial society. Just as with Hume's advice to a sovereign, that task must start with how his audience understands itself. And the description of the middling rank of men just sketched may be best characterized as part reflection of what the middling rank of men think of themselves, how they see themselves, part aspiration for what they might be if they took themselves more seriously. Put differently, in these essays, Hume is trying at once to affirm the basic outlook and disposition of his audience and to educate that audience by giving it some degree of clarity about the world as it is. The difficulty of accomplishing these two somewhat contradictory goals is perhaps evident in the sheer size of the rest of the essays. Carrying out that task, Hume will again confront his readers later on in the book in essays beginning with Of the Original Contract and ending with Idea of a Perfect Commonwealth, with a treatment of English politics that turns out to be concerned primarily with the problem of ideology in politics, and culminates in the praise of a certain kind of skeptical philosophy as the best example of genuine moderation. In the final analysis, it seems, Hume cannot fully spell out what's involved in the moderation of the middling rank of men without pointing to the spirit or temper of philosophy. This leads me to ask, could it be that commerce is Hume's introduction to philosophy, the bait that he uses to attract sleepy readers, in a way parallel to his use of the sovereign's self-interest to bring about the modern revolution? Could it be that commerce itself is another example of Hume's education by indirection? To discuss that would take me too far afield today. Let me finish off the story that began with Hume's advice to the sovereign. The essays on political economy that follow Hume's description of the middling rank of men describe the new world of commercial republicanism in ever-widening focus. Taken together, the 9 essays on commerce and England's place in the modern world form a kind of handbook of practical statesmanship and political economy that complements and, in a sense, completes the institutional political science of part 1 of the essays. Thus, of money and of interest treat domestic policy from the point of view of promoting commerce, while, quote, the balance of trade, of the jealousy of trade, of the balance of power, these are all the titles of essays, treat foreign policy and international trade, culminating in a discussion of a commercial republic's attitude towards war and the threat of foreign ambition for universal empire. The final 2 essays in Hume's Handbook of Practical Statesmanship, of taxes and of public credit, return to domestic matters, albeit matters that bear directly on the polity's ability to project force in conflicts with foreign rivals. Here, let me draw your attention to what Hume says about foreign affairs. In Of the Balance of Trade and of the Jealousy of Trade, Hume argues from a claim implicit in his advice to sovereigns. With regard to commerce, persons and nations cannot pursue their private interests without simultaneously assisting the interests of others. I can't trade with you without you having some benefit. My benefit depends on your benefit. The selfishness of the European nations, including England, in establishing, quote, numberless bars, obstruction, and imposts on foreign trade is worse than immoral. It's foolish and self-destructive. It wasn't a crime, it was a mistake. Hume does not, however, envision a world in which peaceful trade will ever completely replace war. Of the Balance of Power brings Hume's discussion of political economy back to politics proper, and his treatment of commerce and the middling rank of men full circle. The balance of power is the idea that in any given situation, the weaker powers will band together to oppose the strongest power. Hume asks whether the ancient philosophers, knew about the balance of power, or if it was a discovery of modern times. He concludes that while the balance of power could not have entirely escaped the ancient philosophers, it failed them in one crucial case: the Romans. The Romans never met, quote, any such general combination or confederacy against them, but were allowed peaceably to subdue their neighbors, one after the other, until they extended their dominion over the entire known world. Here the moderns are superior, Hume argues. For the idea of a universal monarchy or one country that controls the world did not die with the Romans. It was taken up again in the modern, i.e. post-Renaissance age, first by Charles V of Spain in the 16th century, and later by Louis XIV of France in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Louis's attempt was the most serious, and in the wars against his bid for universal monarchy, Britain, quote, has stood foremost. And now we come back to the peculiar public spiritedness of the middling rank of men. Quote, besides Great Britain's advantages of riches and situations, her people are animated by such a national spirit and are so fully sensible of the blessings of their government that we may hope their vigor never will languish in so necessary and so just a cause. Modern commercial republicanism, it seems, is superior to ancient republicanism because it has discovered a more reliable basis for opposition to universal monarchy than the ancients had. In a real sense, Hume's essays on commerce have thus come full circle. He started these essays by offering amoral advice to a sovereign about how to increase his power. But the advice that he gave, liberate commerce, has the consequence of creating a middle class that will want, sooner or later, to wrest power away from that monarch. Now, near the end of his essays on commerce, Hume shows us the regime of the middling rank of men at war with a sovereign, not the same sovereign, a foreign sovereign now, striving for universal monarchy. Although it was disguised in Hume's original advice to the sovereign, the tension between the middling rank of men and the sovereign's desire for unlimited self-aggrandizement has finally come out into the open completely. Let me conclude by offering a few reflections on what's similar in our current discontents with our political economic regime, which is similar to but not the same as the one that Hume was praising. What's similar to our discontents in Hume's defense of commerce and what's different. Today we worry about the growing wealth of the 1% and the stagnant wages of workers in the American economy. Hume, I think, would share these concerns, although he would come at the issue from a different angle than we usually do, and with a different set of worries in mind. Recall that Hume praises commerce mainly because it undermines feudalism and eventually produced a politically assertive, popular class that opposed the absolute monarchies of Europe. That could only happen because there was widespread improvement in living standards, and because ordinary people could free themselves from dependence on a single feudal lord and replace it with dependence on a wider and more impersonal marketplace. I don't think we ever get away from dependence, but we might be able to have better forms of it. Thus, while Hume would, I think, have been ambivalent about the growing wealth of the people at the top, he would definitely have regarded the stagnation of the middle or lower middle classes in our times as a serious problem for the long-term health of the polity. But this similarity, I think he comes to a similar place to where lots of people are today, masks a deeper difference. For us, concern about economic inequality is often a sentiment based on some conception of justice or morality, as if there was some absolute fairness in the world, there's some absolute fairness out there which the world that we know fails to live up to. Hume's concern is more directly political. Without a middle class emotionally attached to the rule of law and believing that the rule of law serves their interests, constitutional government is not possible in the long run, perhaps, as we're finding out, perhaps not even in the short run. The important question, you might say, is not how to divvy up the economic pie according to some abstract notion of justice, but how to preserve and sustain a culture of constitutionalism. And that in turn requires some reflection on how to get citizens to think for themselves, to reflect on their own interests, to essay in the word that Hume uses as the title of his book. It's not enough that people have the right opinions, although that helps. It's more important that they learn to think for themselves to the extent that they can and in the way in which they can. Put differently, the issue underlying Hume's treatment of commerce is the problem of enlightenment. That problem, it seems to me, is as pressing today as it was when Hume wrote the essays. Thank you. So now I'm told that I take questions from you, and I'm supposed to repeat your questions, so I look forward to them. Please, gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Certainly, Hume was one of the enlightened folks who influenced
Yes.
You mentioned rule of law and separation of power. Where do property rights fit in Hume's thinking?
Okay, so I'm going to try to remember to repeat all the questions for the sake of the tape. The question is, where do property rights fit into Hume's understanding of the rule of law and liberal institutions? Property rights are definitely part of it. I think that's a synonym for the rule of law. And I think that Hume thinks it's important that, for example, that we have a strong norm that contracts are to be observed, things like that. Now, there's a certain amount of conventionality that comes into property rights, right? It's not that they're written up into the heavens, right? And so, for example, Hume, I think, could not have conceived of what does it mean to have a property right in bandwidth or something like that. So he would say, in order to have an economy that works well, we have to have clear property rights. It's better to have those property rights to know who owns it and who we can complain to when they do something bad. But I think what that exactly means has to change with the times for him. And I think he was completely aware that there might be all kinds of different forms of property rights. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but I think that's what he would say. Yeah. So, yes?
You mentioned that Adam Smith and Hume were very good friends.
Yes.
Freely admit it's probably been 50 years since I read Wealth and Nation.
Yes.
Was Smith that cynical?
So that's a good question. I guess in my heart of hearts, I suspect that he was. I take it that the question was Smith as cynical as I describe Hume is? I take that's the...
That's my left-handed way of saying, geez, what a cynic.
Yes, well, okay, so the gentleman says that was his left-handed way of saying, geez, what a cynic. That's the interesting part of your question. I'm not sure that I think of this as cynical. I think of it as a clear-sighted view of the world. But in many cases, our self-interests overlap in ways that we more often overlook the ways in which our self-interests overlap than the opposite. That's my belief, yeah. So I'd be happy to talk more about that if you want to ask another question, yeah. Other questions? Yes, please. Yes, he did. He was a supporter of the Americans becoming an independent nation, although not, so for example, Thomas Jefferson gives us this highfalutin moral argument, there are these natural rights that are being, taken away from us. Of course, we're taking natural rights away from this whole class of black people. Hume doesn't make that kind of argument. He's like, we can't, these guys, they're ornery and they're stupid and they're short-sighted, but they don't want to be ruled by us. And if we are going to enforce our rule over them, it's going to take more time and effort than it's really worth. That's so yes, but he does talk about this in his letters. Yeah. So. Please. Well, yeah. So I'm not sure if I can answer the question about specifically what kinds of industries. I mean, obviously, like he's right before the Industrial Revolution. When he talks about the growth of the middling sword, he's talking about something that he thinks happens between 1500 and 1600, and he thinks that it comes with the growth of cities when the cities are sort of like an enclave outside of the feudal order that start drawing a bunch of goofballs and weirdos, basically. And there are all kinds of things that you can do in cities that you can't do when you're living on a big estate with some guy who says that he owns, a certain portion of your labor. So, I mean, the growth of cities, I mean, it's a well-known thing, right? So that's what he's talking about, is really urban, mercantile, trading your labor. But I think the big thing is that you now are part of a market economy in which you're not dependent on this single customer, right? You've got like 50 customers, and if one of them is a jerk, you can leave. You can say, I don't need your business anymore. But you can only do that if you've got the other 49. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that he has in mind. So, please, yeah.
I'm not sure if Scotland has a public education system as such, but did Hume believe that somehow this middling group could be made more rational, more thoughtful, be more aware of their interests?
I believe that he did, and I think that that's, I mean, you think about what does he actually do. So his most popular books, the essays, so he writes this book called The Treatise of Human Nature, which was the one that he thought, I'm such a genius, this is going to be the best thing ever. And nobody reads it, right? Like it's out of print, and later he tries to disown it. This book is the first one that really starts to get attention, and then he writes a couple of other sort of philosophically oriented things. But his masterwork is the history of England, and that's meant to be a text that is going to shape the public opinion of what is this regime that we live in, how did we get here? And he doesn't think about it, so we tend to think about this question in terms of public schools, right? And there's some reason for us, and that's an important conversation. He thinks about it more in terms of, I want to sell a bunch of books that are going to reach a mass audience, that people are going to read, and that are going to sort of shape the way that they think about the world. And so in that way, he is, in some odd way, sort of more optimistic than we are about the ability of authors to help people be better people, right? That's I think is really the key. So, yes?
Did Hume see slavery as a retrogression toward feudalism and thus an impediment toward the development of this middling sort and enlightenment?
So it's a complicated answer to that. Yes, he says that slavery, and it's actually an amazingly strong phrase. He says that slavery is against the eternal laws of reason and equity. He talks about slavery in the context of his criticism of the ancient republics, which I touched on here. And because the ancient republics only worked because they had slavery, right? And he says, well, that's the great thing about commerce. Commerce, in a way, replaces slavery in terms of this economy. Now, I have to say, in the interest of honesty, that he also says racist things about black people, right? That was a thing that was happening with intelligent, let's say enlightened people of this time who are reading natural science. Jefferson does the same thing. So, yeah, Hume has some warts as well. Yeah. So, are we out of time? Could that be? Thank you. That's great. Appreciate it.